Really late, so I'm going to try and do this in 10 minutes. My name is Dr. Mark David Major. I'm also one of the colleagues at Qatar University. This is a sneak preview of a talk I'll be doing at the Congress for New Urbanism in Savannah, Georgia in about 3 weeks' time. And I'm glad my colleagues have been talking about sustainability because it leads very well into the subject of my talk, which is co-authored with Satana and Nabat about urban resilience. Now, why can't I get this to move? Oh, here we go. So very quickly, what I'm going to talk about is this is a theoretical paper we did, talking about a contradiction at the heart of the urban resilience debate. And it's pretty simple to understand. Everybody's been talking about sustainability. By definition, a sustainable city should be resilient and vice versa. So the question at the heart of the paper is, why has this issue of resilience arisen when we were already talking about sustainability for about 20 years? And this is something we'll be familiar with in Qatar with the blockade and food security and things of this nature. So what we've gone through is conceptual ground clearing exercise, basically to show the contradictions in a lot of the urban resilience debates, and we raised a simple question, which is, what do some of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world have to offer on the issue of resilience? Because by definition, these cities are sustainable and resilient because they've survived for a long time. And what we're going to suggest is, at the end, is that by shifting the focus of the urban resilient debate in this way, we will begin to start to focus more on the humanistic design, walkability, smaller compact urban blocks with this research. So, urban resilience is something that's really arisen in about the last 15 years. In the United States, there were really two traumatic events which led to urban planners starting to talk about resilience. The first was 9/11, and the second was Hurricane Katrina, both of which led to some instantaneous catastrophic loss of life. And part of the resilience debate arose about how these cities, New Orleans and New York, but also how the U.S. economic system rebounded from these events. Now, what's interesting about this is, as horrific as these events were, in terms of 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina in terms of loss of life, the effect of the collapse in the housing market, the financial crisis, and the Great Recession itself was 6 times longer and 6 times deeper than the relatively temporary shock caused by 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. Now, this can be a problem for the design professions, because often design professions are the ones who are coming in after a natural disaster, and they're the ones who are helping to rebuild. So it puts them in a very awkward position because they could be perceived as capitalizing on human misery. Which is a problem with the resilience debate, because to date has tended to focus on how do cities and communities rebound from a natural disaster or a human-made disaster. Now, most architects, and a lot of people have been talking about very specific definitions of sustainability, but most architects and urban planners and urban designers understand sustainability in a very simple way, which is maximizing your efficiencies while reducing your resources, or minimizing your resources for the greatest number of people. This is probably the most simplest definition of sustainability. And it's something that was intuitively understood almost from the very beginning when this term sustainability rose from the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. Resilience, subsequently, about 10 years after we started talking about sustainability, arose, and it became known as the ability of a system to return to a steady state or a state of equilibrium, especially after a disaster. So, for example, how fast can New Orleans recover from Hurricane Katrina? How fast did New York and the U.S. economy recover after the events of 9/11? There's a problem with this definition because what it does is it reinforces the way we've been doing things for the last 100 years with regards to urban planning and urban design and architecture, which is, it's actually inherent in the definition. You're returning to what was before. It's assumed that what was there before was right in the first place, and often it isn't. So what this does is it tends to reinforce what we've been doing over the last century. Here you can see the Thanksgiving Day traffic in Los Angeles. I'm sure everybody's seen this. Suburban sprawl in Phoenix, Arizona, where we are spreading out Autocentric, fragmented communities which are separated from each other that are also subject to dysfunction due to the smallest of temporary shocks. There's many American cities where 2 simultaneous auto accidents will bring the entire road network to a complete halt. And then also inefficient human patterns that lead to a decline in civil society. Now, what's even worse about what's happening in the United States with this debate and what we've been doing is we've been, of course, exporting this all over the world. And you can see the effects in rapidly urbanizing countries, especially China, but also here in Doha, with a lot of the planning can be traced directly back to the American model of planning over the last century or so. So the urban resilience debate, unfortunately, has a tendency to reinforce simply what we're doing already. This is why it has tended to focus often on processes and procedures. This is a kind of convenient definition because then urban resilience becomes whatever you want it to mean. But there needs to be a much more scientific and rigorous approach to urban resilience and sustainability that unites them both together in order to be able to do research and provide real scientific results on what is a sustainable, resilient city. Now, one of the ideas that has risen in the last few years is the idea of evolutionary resilience. This is different from the most common definition of resilience, which is, and I know I'm at the Qatari Society of Engineers, but it's called engineering resilience, which is the idea that you bounce back to what you had before. The idea with evolutionary resilience is that it isn't how you return to a steady state, but how an urban system, how the city bounces forward. That is, how does it evolve? And this gives you a much more dynamic definition of resilience, which you can start to build in things like network science and modeling of cities. With this as a basis, that is, when you put the emphasis on not returning to something, but evolving, how a city evolves, then you can bring the history and the past into it. And this is a list of the 20 oldest, most continuously inhabited cities in the world, beginning with Athens, going all the way to down London. And if you're able to reach back into the past to understand how a city has been resilient and sustainable, these cities become your case study. What do these cities offer that they have endured, they have remained resilient, and they have sustained themselves over such a long period of time? And what we would suggest is, yes, there is a lot of variables at play, and in terms of human population, how we're growing, and regional differences. And I forgot what I was going to say here. But we would say that a key difference is these older cities were designed for people and not things. That is, they weren't designed for cars. They were designed at a human scale for walking, and also for everyday use, not for speeding from one corridor to another. The other thing that we have been doing, especially in the United States over the last 40 years, is what Steve Mouzon refers to as gizmo green solutions. This is the promise of a technological solution in the future so we can just keep doing what we've been doing. As Abdullah said in his talk, by looking back at vernacular architecture, there are solutions for many of these environmental and green building problems that we have because we were doing them for the previous 8,000 to 10,000 years. And ever since the modern period, we have been building things in a way that is inefficient, that is not sustainable, even though we were doing it before. So a more rigorous definition of resilience will actually lead to a more rigorous look at what has worked before and what can we use again in the future. Steve Mouzon calls this the original green, but there's a great example in the abandoned fishing village to the north, Al Jumail. I was there a few weeks ago. It was 32 degrees outside, and you'd walk into this abandoned building and you could feel the temperature drop in the building, even though it's been abandoned for a very long time. This has to do with how the building was constructed. It was constructed to conserve and to maintain a comfortable climate for people. So I'm going to quickly close with the three cities that really fascinate me personally. One's Amman, Jordan. Amman is actually not on this list of 20 cities because it was abandoned for about 475 years, more or less continuous with the Ottoman period, but has grown to be one of the largest cities in the world. It does not have a public rail system. In the United States, you constantly hear that sustainable, resilient communities are built around public rail. However, Amman, except for this brief period where it was abandoned, has subsisted itself for a very long time without rail. Rome, which was the first slide, didn't have a public rail system until 1955. And last but not least, Jerusalem has endured for almost as long of a period. Despite all of its conflicts, it is an incredibly resilient, sustainable city, and it doesn't have a rail system either. So what all these cities seem to have in common, besides the fact that all three of them were built on 7 hills, which I thought was interesting, is that they are built for people. They are compact. They're made to be walked in. Even Amman, with its hilly terrain, is amazing. These have these steps to elevate yourself in section among these hills. And once you start to look at resilience in this way, it will take you back to the human scale. With that, I want to plug my book. For those of you who haven't bought it yet, it's available for outreach. And thank you very much. I hope it was short and sweet.